I will now talk about Black History Month. Black History Month in Britain has been celebrated since 1987. It is a time when we remember and reflect the significance of Black people coming to this country and their contributions that they have made politically, economically, financially, educationally, and socially. It is a time to acknowledge the sacrifice and rich contributions of the Windrush generation and those that have come before. The Windrush. The Empire Windrush came into Tilbury Docks on the 22nd of June 1948. It arrived with 1,027 people, men, women and children, on board. The majority came from the Caribbean islands. They were all British Commonwealth citizens from the Commonwealth. They came to Britain at the invitation of Britain, who put advertisements in the Caribbean newspapers and the post offices. In 1948, the British Nationality Act granted British citizenships and the right of abode to all the empire, all the British Empire, and all the Caribbean islands were British colonies, and they were ruled and run by the Queen, the head of state. And to talk about Windrush and to talk about the contributions of Black people, I've also got to put this in context. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the war. The First World War, people from the Caribbean, from all the Caribbean islands, fought and assisted the British Empire. 116,000 approximately citizens from the Caribbean. In the Second World War, there was 660,000 Black people that fought in the war. Some paid their fares to come to Britain and fight in the war. Others said that they were older. So, for example, there was someone that was very young and he said he was about 5 years younger because he wanted to help Britain. The Black volunteers were sent to assist Britain in the war. Some were sent to Britain, and the white volunteers, they were sent to America because at that time the War Office also had a colour bar. You would really have to look and read a bit more on that. So the Windrush generation, our ancestors, they came here to Britain. Sadly, despite some of them fighting in the war to help Britain, which was called the mother country, they were not welcomed. Some had nowhere to live. There were notices on people's windows in front of their houses saying, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. It was a sad time. The people that came here, they were invited, coming to help and to rebuild the mother country, but the welcome was not pleasing. Some had to live in the air raid shelters. In Clapham South Tube Station, there's an air raid shelter that was used during the war period, and that is where some of the Caribbean people had to live until they could find alternate accommodation. It was difficult finding accommodation, but some of them managed to do so. Black people who came from the Caribbean, if one person, they used to save money, which we called a partner, and that would mean that everybody would pay in a certain amount of money every week, and then another person would get what is called a hand. So then that person would get all the money at the end of the week. And Black people saved this money to try to buy their own property because people didn't want them to live in their houses. And as people saved the money, they then approached bank managers to try and get the mortgage. And also we had difficulties. Some managers didn't want to give Black people mortgages, and some white people didn't want Black people living next to them. So it was a very, very difficult situation. But despite this, we managed to buy houses And as one person bought a house, they would rent a room to other people, and that person would save up, and then that person would buy a house, and so forth. In employment, it was difficult. Many went to what was called the unemployment exchange. There was one in Brixton, and I know the people that were in the air raid shelter Clapham South, some went there and they were able to find jobs, because this country, you know, just suffered a lot of losses, a lot of casualties. They needed labour. So the people that came were actually working in, for example, London Transport, on the buses, on the railways. They were engineers, they worked in factories, they did all different types of jobs. They did office jobs. And an example was some of the adverts in the Caribbean would advertise for a specific person. So, for example, the NHS advertised, they wanted nurses. People would come and they would become nurses. Hence, our NHS had lots of people from the Caribbean, and also London Transport and the railway services and various other industries. In employment, it was hard. Black people at the time were often paid less than their white counterparts. However, they still continued and they worked and they provided a good service. As a result of some of the challenges that we were faced with, there was a revolt, I should call, in Bristol, when people had applied for jobs and they were not given the job because of their race. And as a result, the 1968 Race Relations Act took place that made it illegal for people not to employ people because of the colour of their skin. And also in the 60s and 70s, there was problems in like Oxford Street. Some employers did not want to employ Black people. And the Race Relations Act 1976 followed, the 2000 Race Relations Amendment Act, and then we have the Human Rights Act, Equality Act and Discrimination Act, and also the Commission for Racial Equality was set up. So there was a number of legislation that was set up to make sure there was no discrimination, or to eradicate and try to get rid of racial discrimination, that people were employed, given equality of opportunity, and race relations was promoted for people of all racial groups. And today we can continue to work towards that. All employers have an obligation under the legislation to make sure they do have equality of opportunity and diversity in the workplace. And also in Britain, we still need to work on these things. Employers still need to take responsibilities. This year, I'm pleased to see that a number of companies, a number of organisations are actually having Black History Month events up and down the country. On the internet, you can see a number of events that you can attend. So that's really, really positive. But what we want to see is that we talk about it all the time. We talk about how people are treated in a fair and just way. Black people have a lot of contributions to make. They've made a lot of contributions. So it's important that people are recognised for their skills and they are appointed on merit, and the workplace reflects the community. It reflects the organisation at all levels. We still need to work on our justice system. We need to work on education, housing, and these are other areas that we need to look at. The Windrush Scandal. In 2018, there was a public outcry. They called it the Windrush Scandal. The Home Office, immigration legislation. Black people, particularly from the Caribbean, were being deported, were treated less favourably. And the Windrush Generation refers to from 1948 to 1970, the men, the women, the children, the grandparents that came here. And they came here to help what is called the mother country. A petition was made to Downing Street. The local papers, the mainstream papers were all writing and complaining about the unjust treatment, the racism, the discrimination, the hostile environment towards Black people who were Caribbean citizens, who were Caribbean, but they were British citizens from the colonies. They were suffering discrimination and racism, but they had the right to abode. The Home Office was being racist. They refused to accept that the Black people were British citizens, despite being here 50 or 60 years ago. They were living here, they worked here, they went to school, or their children went to school. The Home Office had destroyed the boarding parties from the Empire Windrush, yet they were asking people to provide information that they previously held. They paid their taxes. There's NHS records, national insurance records, government records, records of people going to school. Yet the Home Office kept asking for further information. Sadly, a lot of people lost their jobs, their home. They lost their home. They were made homeless. There were breakdowns in families. People were deported, elderly people, people with disabilities. Many were put in detention centres. Detention centres were like a prison. Some had to come and sign in every week. And when you went to sign every week, you wasn't sure that you was going to go back home. Some were detained and put on a plane. Sadly, many died. It was a disgrace by the Home Office and the government. The Home Office still haven't learned lessons, despite the independent report that found that it had been racist and discriminated against Black people of the Windrush generation. I believe this is one of the worst examples of racism and discrimination by the Home Office. The Home Office has stated that they will provide staff with training, they're going to carry out sweeping reforms, they're going to have an improvement plan. This is still not working. They have promised that their immigration law will be fit for purpose and lessons will be learnt. There will be better decision making, and this has yet to be put in place. I'm just going to talk about a few stories. One of the scandals, I don't know if you heard, it was on the news, it's been in the papers. One of the people that suffered as a result of this hostile environment, her name was a lady from the Midlands. She died sadly in the summer at the age of 64. She came to the UK at the age of 10. She lived here for, 50 plus years. And one day she got a paper saying that she's not a British citizen. She's not British, that she shouldn't be here. And the Home Office started to request documents. She provided documents upon documents, and she had to sign in on a regular basis. And one day they just detained her. She was in a detention centre with many other people, people that were disabled, elderly people. And she was about to be put on the plane. And then fortunately for her, there was legal representation, and they managed to get this stopped, but she suffered horrendously. It affected her well-being, and sadly she passed away in the summer of this year. There were other people, elderly people, who went to the Caribbean to bury a loved one or to visit a loved one, and when they came back, they were refused entry to this country. They had been here for 50 years, 60 years. They'd given everything to the UK. They paid their national insurance. Some of them had worked in the NHS. And as we know, we're in a pandemic. It's a very, very difficult time. A third of the people that are passing away are people from BME communities. Yet they were some of the people that were looking after the NHS. They were providing the service. And their children and their children's children continue to work in NHS and various government departments today. Compensation scheme. The government introduced what is called a compensation scheme for people that have actually suffered as a result of the Windrush scandal. It is not fit. The form has many pages. It's still asking for information that they asked for many, many years ago. And when people complete the forms, they have been written to and asked for more information, and a few have been offered compensation. The compensation is very small. And for some people that have been trying to fight their case for 10 years, they were offered a few £1,000s. This is something that needs to be revisited. So that's just an example. The Windrush scandal has had an impact on all of the community. It's been horrendous. Everybody knows somebody that has been affected. I've seen, you see immigration vans come at whatever time in the morning, and the people that came here from the Caribbean, they were Commonwealth citizens. It was a British colony. They had a right to stay here, and the government has acted in the incorrect, inhumane way. Moving on from there, I just wanted to talk about a couple of personal experiences. I was born in this country. I was born in London, and going to school, we had a few people that came from the Caribbean. And I remember when people from the Caribbean came to my school, I was asked to look after some of them. And they had a language centre in the borough because the government believed that they needed to learn to speak the language. Now, these people came to the country, they already knew the British language. They were in a British colony, yet they were sent to a language centre, and it was assumed that their level of education was not as high, and they were sometimes put into the lowest group because we had bands. They were put into the lowest group. And what I found with the people that came from the Caribbean, the children, their level of education was higher than mine. I was embarrassed. One of my friends, and I've known her for many, many years since she came to this country, she was excellent at maths. She went on to work in the bank, and she's done many, many years working in the banking industry. Her English, the level of education in the Caribbean is fairly high. A lot of the people went to private school, and when they came here, they said, we did this two years ago, or we did this a year ago. The British government just assumed that the Caribbean children were not educated to a high standard. And indeed, they were educated to a very, very high standard. What I also found, it was difficult when we went to college or we went to work, we also experienced racism. Hence the Race Relations Act and equal opportunities policies that were introduced in local authorities and in the government. So it was very difficult. As children, we were told that we had to be twice as good. It was important to get your education. And despite being twice as good and having your education, on occasions you wondered, why didn't you get that job? It was very, very difficult. And it was more difficult for the men than what it was for the women. During the time of the Windrush generation, I recall a gentleman telling me that if they tried to go into a pub, they couldn't do so. They were chased and they were beaten, and there was altercations. So there was lots of things sort of going on that time. However, the black people were very, very resilient, and they tried their best. They built this country. This country is built on the back of people from the Caribbean and other countries. And we've done so much. They've contributed, our ancestors have contributed so much. I recall my grandmother coming to this country, my parents coming to this country, and how they worked very, very hard. They had a hard work ethic. They told us that we should work hard and do the best that we could. And we should work and, education, make sure that we get our qualifications, and we continue to do so. I want to just give you some examples of, despite the adversity, people have been very resilient from the Caribbean. This country was called the mother country. I recall my mum telling me when she was in the Caribbean, the Queen come in and everybody came out to welcome her. So she got to see the Queen in person before coming to this country. And many of the people that came to the country, they've contributed substantially. And I want to make reference to this book. I don't think you're going to be able to see it, but this book is called Windrush 70. It's called Windrush 70. I do have a PDF of the book, and I am going to get permission from the Windrush Foundation that has wrote the book, if I can actually circulate it to people who would like a PDF. And if you would like a copy of the PDF, please can you send me or Sasha an email. I'm going to give examples of the Windrush 70. This book, the Windrush 70, was introduced 2 years ago when we were celebrating 70 years of people coming to this country on the Empire Windrush. The book covers pioneers and champions, and I'm going to talk about some of our pioneers and champions. The first pioneer that I'm going to make reference to, his name is Sam King. He was a RAF veteran. He returned to England after serving in the war in 1948 to make a new life for himself. He making a difference to the lives of others and the community. He was the mayor, first black mayor of Southwark. C&C have properties in Southwark. It's a neighbouring borough. He was also a councillor in Southwark. He came here when he was 18. He also helped set up the Windrush Foundation, hence this book. So Sam King. Another person that I'm going to make reference to is a lady called Claudia Jones, a brilliant organizer and speaker. Claudia Jones was at the forefront of Britain's civil rights struggle in the 1950s. She was a civil rights activist. She appeared at the front of this book, so I don't know if you can see, but at the front cover of this book there is a picture and it's like a little stamp. And that was a British the post office stamp, which they declared she was a woman of distinction in 2008. She also created the West Indian and Asian News. She organised a carnival at St Pancras Town Hall, and the idea behind this was to get people together despite the adversity that they were going through in this country. And she was also the inspiration behind the Notting Hill Carnival. I'm also going to talk about Lord Herman Ouseley. He sits in the House of Lords. He has dedicated over 50 years to local government, public life. He was Director of Education. He was the chair of this Commission for Racial Equality. He sits in the House of Lords, and he also was lead on a number of inquiries, including an inquiry into, I think it was Bradford. And he's also, yes, he wrote the report on race relations in Bradford in 2001. And this said he's a public service, his public service career, he's risen to the top. He's led a lot of institutions in the country, which earned him a knighthood and a peerage. Patricia Scotland, another lady that has succeeded. She would have been the first generation. She came here as a young child. She's Baroness Queen's QC. She was called to the bar in 1977 at the age of 35. She received a life peerage in 1997, and she was the first black woman to become a QC since the 18th century. We also have Mrs. Felix OBE. She is a Methodist minister. She set up the hostel in the borough of Lewisham called the Marsha Phoenix Trust for young girls. She's a community activist. She was the mayoress of Lewisham, and she's worked tirelessly for the community and young people to improve the lives in the borough. And she is a wonderful lady. The hostel there's 2 hostels now, and we may at CNC have had at some stage young people that have actually come into our accommodation. And I'm just going to make reference to Trevor Phillips. I'm not going to say a lot. He's written a book on the Windrush with his brother, Mike. He's also worked for the Commission of Racial Equality, now Commission for Equalities, and he's done a lot. He's a high flyer, and he's been a broadcaster, and he's been key in what has been happening with the Black generation. So these are just a few people that, despite what we've been through, they have actually done a lot, come into this country. These are significant people. There are pioneers, there are champions. And I just wanted to read a poem very quickly. This poem was written when we were celebrating the 50 years of the Windrush. There was a gala concert by the BBC, and it's a poem that's written by a young child, which is dedicated to her grandmother. And it says, "Our survival in the promised land. For most Caribbean people to go to England, it was a dream, a chance in life, or so it would seem. The chance did come. It was all booked up before too long. For £28, they could go to the promised land. They took one last look at the Caribbean sun, sea and sand. They boarded on the 24th of May, unknowing what would be their fate. They waved goodbye as they left their roots, wearing bright ties and suits. They were in search of work, lodgings, or a holiday. They began their journey. They were on their way, but they were anxious to know if it was true that what they had been told. Were the streets paved with gold? 3 weeks later, arriving at Tilbury Docks, they were just ignored by all people and mocked. They found lodgings and work. It was a lot of headache. Wouldn't people just give them a break? Some returned, most stayed and learned. They laid some kind of foundations for me and for future generations. Many followed in their footsteps. They were footstones, a steady step. They put hope in people's hearts. The survival of the Caribbean people in the promised land was about to start. A new page in history, the day the Empire Windrush took to the sea." And this is written by a 12-year-old in memory of her grandmother, who sailed on the Empire Windrush in 1948. So they're just a few things that I wanted to share with you. It was a difficult journey for many of our ancestors, but despite many have achieved wonderful things, they've contributed to this country politically, economically, socially, culturally, and they have a right to be here. They are part of the British Empire. They are British citizens, and the government need to address the wrongs and ensure that the people that are still waiting for their cases to be looked at is looked at, and we can all continue to get on with life and to live in a diverse community. We should celebrate differences, and we should celebrate the contribution that everybody has made. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I accept the clapping on behalf of the ancestors and the struggles of all those that have come before, because they've made the way for my generation as the first generation born here, and for future generations to come. It's important we continue to share our Black history. It's important that we don't just share it in October, we can share it at any time of the year. And everybody has got skills, everybody's got abilities, and I think it's important that all organizations look at what is happening in society, and we make sure we all play our part in making sure this is a fair and just place.